Well, good morning, y'all. You awake today? First service, we provided free shots of espresso just to keep everybody in the game. Well, today we are continuing in our series. We're probably kind of midway or so. The series we're going through an overview of the Bible. And we're delving a little deeper into the pages of the Bible because if we're going to believe that the Bible is our source of truth, then we need to build a kind of a systematic belief system that is consistent with the teachings of the Bible. And most of us don't give that a lot of thought. And so what we're really trying to do is to, in this series, look at a lot of different aspects of the Bible that we wouldn't normally look at from a perspective that we normally wouldn't teach from on a Sunday morning to try to gain a different perspective on a lot of the teachings. And last week, if you had the privilege of being here, you were part of a service where we covered 34 books of the Old Testament in just 24 minutes, as many people make sure to point out that I didn't do it in 20, it was 24 minutes last week. And so not to be undone, I feel like we can set a new record. So today, we're going to cover 400 years of history in just 15 minutes, all right? And I couldn't think of a better day to cover 400 years of history than Time Change Sunday, because I'm sure everybody will be right there with me. So here's the deal. When you open your Bible and you go to the last page of the Old Testament, which is in Malachi chapter 4, verse 6, it's the last verse of the Bible. And when you do this, all of a sudden, you're in the New Testament. Now, what most people don't really understand, that between here and here, there are 400 years of history. And the period of time between Malachi and where Jesus is born in the Gospel of Matthew is known as the intertestamental period, the time in between the Old and the New. And a lot of people refer to this as the 400 years of silence because it appears that God goes dark, right? That no more speaking through his prophets as he had for so many hundreds of years. No more, appearing to the people in a pillar of cloud by day or a pillar of fire by night. No more being involved in the affairs of the Jews as he was before. Something changed. We will never see God again like we saw him in the Old Testament. He will never appear like that again as we move forward. Something changed between the Old and the New that made everything different. And so it is this 400 years that I want to focus in on this morning. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, it gives us a little bit of an insight into what happened because it says, "But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to free those who were also under the law, that we might be adopted by God as his children." Now, the phrase that I'm going to focus in on this morning is that phrase where it says, when the time had fully come, or we could also translate to say that Jesus came at just the right time, right? So have you ever wondered why Jesus came at the time that he did? It was almost like for 400 years, God set the stage for the arrival of his Son. And I want to spend a few minutes this morning just talking about and taking a look at what happened in the time period between the Old and the New that created the exact right time for Jesus to be born. All right? So first of all, there's going to be three different things I want to talk about. And the first one is that the time was right culturally. If you remember where we left off last week, you may remember that the Jews had become a conquered people. And no longer were they concentrated in their homeland of the promised land of Israel, but they were truly now scattered throughout the entire world. They were exiled into other countries. And those Jews that returned home under the rule of the Persians were allowed to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple and the walls, which we read about in the Old Testament. And so while they were technically still ruled by the Persians, they could enjoy some form of independence because basically the Persians just left them alone to do their own thing. All right? Now, in 331 BC, that all ends because Alexander the Great, which may be a name that's familiar to you, he defeats the Persian king Darius III. And when he conquers Persia, he in essence is conquering Israel and taking over Israel because Israel at the time was under Persian rule. And so, in many respects, Alexander the Great has really been regarded as one of the greatest conquerors in all of history because he conquered so much of the ancient world in such a short period of time. But the main vision, like the vision behind Alexander the Great, it doesn't seem like it was malicious, but what he was really trying to do was to create one big worldwide empire where everybody would be unified under one language, one custom, one civilization. So if Alexander the Great had his way, we'd all be Greek today, right? And so under his influence, he created a process called Hellenization, which was the process by which he was getting people to accept the Greek traditions and customs and religions and ultimately language. And so Hellenism became so popular that it actually persisted for some 100 years even after the Alexander the Great because really the Greek culture had become wildly fun in that day. Like it was kind of like New York is today, kind of sexy and advertising and fashion, and the Greek culture was a lot of that. It was bringing it to kind of the ancient world. And so there were many Jews who became known as Hellenized Jews who were still Jewish. They still believed in God, but they were slowly accepting Greek customs. And this actually gets pretty prevalent to understand in the epistles when the Apostle Paul begins to teach in other areas of the world. But there's no question that the biggest impact that the Greeks have on culture at the time was the introduction of the Greek language. And so for the first time, most people became bilingual in a very short period of time, and speaking Greek was as prevalent back then as English is today. It became the language of business and tourism. And so it was during this time then that the Old Testament of the Bible was translated from the original Hebrew language into the Greek. And this was called the Septuagint. And the Septuagint is really just the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. But it's important because it meant that no longer would there be a language barrier that existed among all people, and that everybody for the first time had access to a set of scriptures that they could actually read and understand. It wasn't in Hebrew anymore. So that was important to understand culturally. But then I think the time was also right geopolitically. And there's a lot here, and I'm only going to be able to scratch the surface, but let me just introduce it by saying that the independence that the Jews enjoyed ended in 63 BC, when a Roman general named Pompey conquered the ancient world, and along with it, he conquered of Israel. The Jewish people had been under foreign occupation and oppression for hundreds of years. I mean, after Alexander the Great was 2 or 3 other empires that were conquering each other, taking over, and the Israelites were like little ping pong balls, just kind of bouncing around. They were this small little group of people that were just at the whim of all of these large empires that were taking over the world one after the other, until finally now the Romans come in. And everybody had left them alone up until this point, but the Romans come in pretty heavy-handed. And so it's not an exaggeration to say that the Jewish people were just a little tired of being a conquered people. And understandably, they wanted to be free. They wanted their independence. And so much so, I think, that when they started reading the scriptures from a point of desperation, that they read into the scriptures something more than what was even there. Because when they read about the promised Messiah, the one who would come and deliver Israel, they begin to think politically. They believe that God was going to send them somebody who will lead a rebellion to overthrow the Roman Empire to win back their independence so that they can reclaim the land that God had given them. Little did they know that that ship has sailed. With the lack of acceptance of God by their forefathers and their unfaithfulness. And so the Messiah that was coming, little did they know, was not coming to save them from the Romans and from Roman rule, but the Messiah that was coming was to deliver them from themselves. So as the years roll on through this 400-year period, and as in the Jewish tradition, as they talk about this coming Messiah, the one who is to deliver the people, it's really this growing idea that this person is going to be like a hero, right? That he's going to be like a very strong military person who's going to lead them out of the oppression from under the Romans. When you look at the Roman map, if you can pull that up, so this is the area, I don't know what color to call that, weird color, but that's all the area that is controlled by Rome. And if you look, Rome, Italy, over here, the boot. But if you look, it's all the way, the promised land is all the way over here where Jerusalem, Judea is. It's a piece of, a desert strip on the far side of the Mediterranean. And it's not like the Romans really cared about this strip of land, but it had value to them in the fact that they could tax the Jews, they could get goods from the Jews, and so really they just wanted to just kind of leave them out there and collect money and collect what they could out of them, but they really just didn't want any problems. But as you can imagine, there were Roman soldiers running around occupying the land, kind of policing. There were tax collectors that were running around taking taxes from the people, and there was this growing resentment by the Israelites against the Romans. And so what happened was, then you had rebels that started popping up. And so in the intertestamental period, you had the Maccabees who were big rebels. They were the ones that, fought off, had this oil in the lamps that wouldn't end. And so that's the beginning of Hanukkah, the celebration of Hanukkah. But you have this group of people that are called the Zealots that emerge kind of toward the end of the intertestamental period. And this was a political party that really refused to conform to the Romans. And so, it was so intense that some of the Zealots would actually carry around little daggers in their cloaks. And whenever they saw a Roman soldier who was by himself, they would just jump him and kill him. I mean, that was pretty common practice. So when you understand that kind of political context about the Zealots, then when you go to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, and you read that one of Jesus' disciples was a zealot named Simon, you go, wow, like this is pretty radical, that this is on, Jesus' posse here. And you wonder, okay, did this guy follow Jesus because he believed that he was the Son of God, or was he following Jesus because he believed that Jesus was going to really lead this rebellion to overthrow the Romans? And then on the other side of the coin, you have another disciple named Matthew, who was a tax collector on behalf of the Romans. And so you have to believe that Simon and Matthew really didn't get along, right? I mean, you kind of feel like there was probably a tension that existed, at least in the beginning, where these two guys, they didn't like each other, because I'm sure that Simon's sitting there going, Matthew's just like a big sellout to his people. So there was a lot of dynamics that were happening. Also, when you look at this kind of the historical context, you then begin to understand why in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1, verse 1, it begins with the genealogy of Jesus. The New Testament begins with the genealogy of Jesus because it traces the entire lineage of Jesus all the way back from Abraham, Jacob, King David, all the way down to Mary and Joseph, it's not really interesting reading, but what it's really doing is helping us to understand that, look, when Jesus is being crucified and they're mocking him, calling him the King of the Jews, there's legitimacy to that. Jesus really was the legitimate King of the Jews. Like, he's from the line of David, the King David. He was like in line to become a legit king. So that also helps us to understand like the story of Herod, right? Where Herod is like the political appointee. He's a lackey for the Romans, and he's just kind of a figurehead, but he wants to keep his power and authority. And so when he hears that Jesus is being born, who is of the line of David, who is a legit king, he goes out and he kills all the baby boys. Remember the story in the Christmas story? He goes out and kills all the baby boys. Why? Because he's trying to protect his throne, because Jesus was a legit successor to the throne. So when you start looking at the historical context of the Bible, you begin to realize there's all kinds of complicated dynamics that are happening all throughout the Bible that make it very interesting. But the last point that I want to make about the geopolitical part was one of the most significant things that Rome brought to the table when they took over is they created what was called Pax Romana, which is Roman peace. But it was they wanted peace, but it was primarily economically driven. They really wanted political and economic stability throughout the land. So they didn't want to mess with the Israelites. They just wanted their money. They wanted to tax them. They wanted their goods. They wanted to be able to do that. So really what happened was, for the first time, you have law and order happening. You have like a real civilization occurring under the Roman Empire, and you have a real economy beginning to emerge. And the Romans were the first one who actually were creating highways. So they created highways all along the Roman Empire. So now all of a sudden, and they did it really so that there could be free trade, import, export from all the different countries. And if you ever hear the phrase, all roads lead to Rome, that's why. Because all roads led to Rome. Everything was rolling up into Rome, into their economy. But what that does is, for the first time, it paved the way, excuse the pun, for the gospel to reach every part of the modern world when the apostles begin to get outside of Israel and begin to teach into the entire world the Christian faith like they never had access before. All right, last point is that the time was also right religiously. So in our passage that we're looking at in Galatians chapter 4, it says that God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, right? To free those who were also under the law. Well, what does that mean that Jesus was born under the law? Over that 400-year period, the Jewish faith had become something different than what it was intended to be. It had become very politicized, and it was all about keeping the laws of the Jewish faith, to the point that there was a lot of judgmentalism that was occurring if you didn't, or you screwed up, or you weren't one of the elite. And so while Jewish law started out very simply with the 10 Commandments, that was the 2 tablets that was given by God to Moses, which is the core of the law, it actually grew, as Greg talked about a few weeks ago, into 613 commandments that actually made up the entirety of the Jewish law at that time. And so the evolution of these commandments derive from the first 5 books of the Bible, for the most part, which are called the books of law. We call it the Pentateuch in the Christian faith. But in the Jewish faith, those first 5 books of the Bible are actually called the Torah. And that's because it contains most of the law. And so the religious leaders of that day had gained a significant amount of power as the keepers of the law. And so what I want to do is to introduce to you 4 different groups of religious leaders that I think are important to know to gain a better understanding of context when we're reading through the New Testament, because these 4 groups of religious leaders pop up from time to time in our readings of the New Testament. So, first of all, again, remember the Romans are ultimately in charge. They're ruling. It's their empire. It's their world. The Jews are just living in it, right? And the Romans didn't want any problems from the Jews, so they gave them just enough power to make them happy without giving them any real power at all. And so the Romans gave this limited authority to a group of Jewish leaders called the Sanhedrin. And this was a group of 71 religious leaders who were the religious and moral authority of the Jews. Now, if you think about it, these guys had a lot of power. If you committed adultery or you were accused of committed adultery, they could put you to death. If you didn't keep the Sabbath, they could have you arrested. They could make an accusation against you and make your life a living hell. So they had a lot of power without having power. And you also may remember it was actually the Sanhedrin that are the ones that accused Jesus of the things that he did, that they said, and had Jesus arrested, right? So they had the power to arrest Jesus. They had the power to try Jesus under religious law, but they did not have the power to put Jesus to death. So therefore, they had to take Jesus to who? Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor, the Roman ruler at the time. And so it was ultimately Pontius Pilate who had the power and the authority to sentence Jesus to death. So, and by the way, they spent their time talking with Pontius Pilate. They were trying to convince Pontius Pilate not of their own religious law. They were trying to convince them that Jesus was a zealot, that he was causing problems for the Romans, and that's why he should be put to death. So in exchange for a little bit of power, the Romans gave them, the Sanhedrin promised Rome that they would spy and report on their own people and report back when there were any Jewish rebels or troublemakers that the Romans would want to know about so that they could just keep the peace. So especially when it was convenient for them, like with Jesus, they could accuse this guy of doing whatever and then have him, put to death before the Roman government. So the Sanhedrin is made up of three groups of people. And these are names that we hear a lot through the New Testament. We hear about the Sadducees. The Sadducees mean the righteous ones. The Sadducees were considered to be the upper class in that they held more power than their religious counterparts because they were wealthier. They had more money, so they had more clout and power. And so they weren't very popular with the common folk because they flaunted their wealth a lot. The Sadducees embraced the Greek customs that Rome was introducing because it created for them a much more lavish lifestyle. They could afford to buy all the fine fabrics and fashion that the Greeks were introducing. Then there were the Pharisees, who we read the most about in the New Testament, and they were the more popular group of the middle class. And the Pharisees were all about maintaining appearances, making sure that everyone around them knew how religious that they were. They literally thought that they were better than everybody else and looked down on anybody who would be considered a down and outer or a sinner. And so I promise you they would not fit well here at Westridge and think we're just a bunch of sinners, which we are, by the way. The Pharisees were all about looking good on the outside, while on the inside, their hearts were cold, and they were all about protecting their own interests, not the interests of the people. The third group were the scribes. And many scholars believe that the scribes were simply kind of the next echelon of Pharisees, the elite. They were more educated, more respected. You might even go as far as to call them the lawyers of Jerusalem, in that they studied like nobody else did. And so the scribes had three main jobs. The first job was that they copied the scriptures by hand, thus the name scribes. They interpreted the law. So when there was an argument or a debate, it was the scribes who would settle it and say, well, here's what the law means. And then the third was they were the ones who really did most of the teaching in the temple and in the synagogues, and so they were also referred to as the teachers of the law. So these guys were like, the elite of the elite. But listen to what Jesus has to say about them in the Gospel of Mark, right? So Jesus says, watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted in the marketplace and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. But they devour, they prey on widows' houses, meaning that they will take the widows' offerings that they give in the temple, and they will enrich themselves on, for somebody else who's poor. And they will, make a show, and they'll pray lengthy prayers so that everybody around them sees them praying. Such men will be punished most severely. So I don't think that Jesus had a lot of respect for the scribes, right? And so it was under this environment, it was in this context that Jesus was born under the law. As our passage in Galatians 4 says, meaning that religion in that day was off. After that 400-year period, it was off. It had become politicized and judgmental. And really what was happening was the religious leaders were enriching themselves both financially and with power, and they were keeping common people out. They were creating a separation between God and the people, and they were pushing the people away from God rather than bringing them in. I mean, listen to what Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew 23. He says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites." He says that time and time again. He says, "You shut the door of heaven in people's faces." You just slam the door of heaven in. "But you yourselves do not enter, nor will you let any of those others enter who are trying to." So they literally were keeping people away from God. And it just incensed Jesus like nothing else. And these religious leaders were considered to be the gatekeepers of religion. And if the law was the lock on the gate, then Jesus was the one who was breaking that gate down to make God accessible to all people for the first time in hundreds of years. I don't think that we can really understand the true impact of Jesus' words as he comes in and he just completely annihilates what religion had become in that day. He says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but in the inside you're full of dead man's bones and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you're full of hypocrisy and wickedness." What Jesus was really saying was, you just have empty rituals. Like, unless you have something on the inside that matters. God cares about your heart. God cares about who you are. And so Jesus just blew this religion out of the water. And needless to say, there was a tension that arose between Jesus and the religious leaders that did not stop, and we'll continue to see that throughout the rest of the New Testament until they finally get him killed. So for 400 years, God set the stage for his son's arrival, right? Culturally, where there was the creation of this one language, there was economic and political stability, there were roads that made everything accessible, and everything was teed up so that when the Christian faith was about to be pushed out to the world, everything was ready at just the right time. Jesus was born. Born under the law, so that he could free all of us from the same law that he was born under, from the same thing that religion had become. Jesus broke the death grip that the law and religious leaders had on religion and God at that time. And it was like he kicked the doors of heaven open and said, "All right, now all y'all come in. You may be all a bunch of messed up sinners, but you're my bunch of messed up sinners. Come on in." And it made God accessible for the first time, where people could have a relationship with God. God was no longer silent, but Jesus, the Son of God, was in their midst. Jesus did everything that he did. He took on the religious leaders. He went to the cross. He was beaten. He was nailed to the cross. He broke through the gates of hell. He rose from the dead. He did it all for one thing. Because he saw that without the real Messiah, without the promised one, the one who could free us from the law, the one who could give us forgiveness and grace, that we would all just be lost. that we just all continue. I mean, you just look through the history of the Old Testament and the New Testament. I mean, it's just a group of we're a bunch of messed up people who just can't seem to get it right. And Jesus knew. And the good news of the gospel is that while we were still a bunch of messed up sinners, Jesus came, broke the doors of heaven open, and said, y'all come. Y'all come.